beginning of World War II, I had to go into the army. At least I didn't have to. I was just pushed into the army. I was in the infantry, and I was working in a battle school in Swanage in Dorset, and I saw an ACI, which is an Army Council Instruction, looking for soldiers to be trained as cameramen for the Army Film Unit. And I thought I was very interested in that because I was a keen photographer, stills photographer before the war. So I applied for that, and to my astonishment, I was one of the 18 who were selected out of a couple of hundred people. And so I was trained as a cameraman at Pinewood Studios, and I was a cine cameraman, not a stills cameraman. And eventually, of course, we were particularly being trained for the invasion, wherever that was going to take place and when it was going to take place. And in fact, on the 6th of June 1944, I landed with my camera, a bag of film and a pistol with the Royal Marine Commandos at a place called Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer on the 6th of June 1944. And I can tell you I was very frightened. A lot of other people were too, but that's how I got into the business as an army cameraman. And my CEO at that time, a man called Hugh Stewart, had been an editor before the war. Not that he'd edited very much, but he had been an editor. And we became quite close colleagues. In fact, he arranged for me to be commissioned in Holland in 1944. And eventually I had to go to the Far East after the war in Europe was over. I spent a year in the Far East, and Hugh Stewart said, although he wasn't out there, he said, if you want to come back after the war, if you want to come back into the film business, I can probably get you into the editing department. So he was working for MGM at Boreham Wood, even though they hadn't made any films yet. And I was taken on as a trainee assistant editor at MGM, and eventually, after a few years, I got my break and I started cutting movies, and I've eventually cut well over 30 features, including the one that we're talking about, which is the plum of the year, 1969-70, which was The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, directed by Billy Wilder. Everybody wanted that movie, but I got it, because Walter Mirisch, the producer, one of the producers, said, would you like to work with Billy Wilder? And I was working in California at the time on a film called The Shoes of the Fisherman. That was for MGM. And Walter gave me a call, would I like to meet Billy Wilder? And I said, well, who wouldn't? I'll come over anytime you say. So I went to Goldwyn Studio on North Formosa in Los Angeles, met Billy Wilder and his co-writer I.A.L. Diamond, Izzy Diamond. We had a very nice meeting, and he said, you're going to cut my movie? And I said, yes, thank you very much. That's exactly what I want to do. And that's how it started.
Could you tell us something about how the picture was planned and executed?
Yes, well, after my meeting in California, I eventually came back to this country, having finished The Shoes of a Fisherman. And The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, the movie, was to be planned to be shot at Pinewood Studios. And so I'm back at Pinewood, like my old army days, for the first time, in fact. So I was given the script, the original script, which I still have here. And you can see it's a very large script. And it was shot exactly as scripted, because Wilder and Izzy Diamond said they'd worked probably for about 10 years preparing the script. And they said, having spent that time on it, they thought it was right, and that's the way it was going to be shot. And in fact, when they were shooting all these sequences, Izzy Diamond was on the side of the set, watching the actors and the action, and if there was one word out of place, he would say, cut. Not Wilder, but Izzy Diamond said cut, because they said, this is the script, these are the right words, and they've got to be spoken as per script. No changes at all, and that's the way they shot the film. Now, it was originally planned as a rather long film of 4 separate episodes discovered in a vault in a bank in London by the grandson of Dr. Watson. 4 episodes which have never been published or heard of before. They were totally new stories of Holmes and Watson, and of a rather personal nature. That was the idea. And they were, the basic 4 stories were: The Curious Case of the Upside Down Room, The Singular Affair of the Russian Ballerina, The Adventure of the Dumbfounded Detective, and The Dreadful Business of the Naked Honeymooners. Now, they were all shot, and when we eventually finished the first cut, which I took to California, to the Mirage Corporation, the film ran way over 3 hours, and not much short of 4 hours. And to my astonishment, they were surprised. But having seen the script in the first place, it was obvious it was going to be a long movie. So we had a long series of screenings in California, and eventually I suggested that we could remove the upside down room completely. It meant a little bit of juggling with voice from Dr. Watson. And so we did that. I came back to England, we did that. It was still too long. So we now dropped one other episode, which was the Dreadful Business of the Naked Honeymooners, which was only about a 14-minute sequence. Having dropped those 2 sequences, we now had a film which is just over 2 hours, which is really the ideal length. But the tragedy of it all was that the Naked Honeymoon sequence was a very expensive sequence, involved a very large model liner, which was so large that it was put not in a studio tank, but in the sea off the Isle of Wight. And it was a very expensive and wonderful sequence. It was absolutely brilliant, because it meant that Dr. Watson was saying to Holmes at the beginning of the sequence, "I've been with you for so many years, Holmes, I know exactly now how you work, and I think I could do it myself." And that was the object of this episode. Watson had his chance to solve an apparent murder in a cabin in this, on this liner. And of course he made an absolute mess of it, a hash of it. And it was so wonderfully funny. And the Mirage Corporation said, "Well, whatever you do, neg cut that sequence. Let's have it dubbed and answer printed and ship it to us in California, because one day we'll probably put that on television as a little episode." The Upside Down Room was a thing which Watson had figured out to get Holmes off the cocaine habit, which he was going rather wildly at the time. So he figured out an apparent murder in a London room, and when they arrived, he and Holmes and Lestrade, the inspector, they entered this room and everything was upside down. The table and the chairs were on the ceiling and the lights were on the floor. And there was a body on the floor, on the ceiling in other words. And of course Holmes eventually figured out how Watson had figured this trick. And so that was a funny sequence, but totally different from the liner sequence. But I must say that my experience of working on the one and only film that Billy Wilder shot in this country, in England, was a wonderful experience. I mean, I worked with some fine directors like George Cukor, Robert Wise, and others of very high caliber American directors. But Wilder, of course, is unique, and he shot the film in such a way that my work was relatively easy. It was a question of just taking the clappers off, more or less, and hooking it all together. So my work in the cutting room was very quickly done every day, because we cut film as the film is being shot. What we see yesterday, I'm cutting today. And doing it so quickly, because it was so relatively easy, I could spend a lot of time down on the set watching the operation of shooting. And that, of course, was a big plus as far as I'm concerned. I'm not wild about spending a lot of time on the sets of films that I'm cutting, but in this case, it was something which was not to be missed, and I had the opportunity, and I took it.
Okay, I remember that Billy Wilder originally planned to have Peter O'Toole and Peter Sellers playing the roles of Holmes and Watson. Was that still actually locked in at the time you started?
No. In fact, I did hear that statement earlier on, but by the time I was interviewed in California, and eventually some months later when we started shooting at Pinewood Studios, it was now certainly Robert Stevens and Colin Blakely, and no other names were ever mentioned as far as I could see. And of course, it's a very sad thing we don't have Colin with us anymore, because he was, I mean, they're both wonderful actors, but Colin was, as far as I could see, and I can still remember it like yesterday, he was the perfect Dr. Watson as far as I was concerned. And of course, they were both lovely people to work with. And as I said earlier on, I spent a lot of time on the set watching the operation of shooting, and in between takes, Robert and Colin would talk to me. It so happened that I'd written a technical book about the film cutting room, which had just been published at that time, which they found very interesting. So we had lots of conversations on the set in between takes, which is the sort of thing I've never had the opportunity to do before. It was a marvelous experience. You didn't find Mr. Wilder, and he was called mostly Mr. Wilder, a man very easily to get close to. Now, we had a wonderful working relationship, there's no question about that. But as long as you knew your job, there was no problem. But if there were other people on that unit who either were a little bit confused about their job or tried to be the funny man. Now, Mr. Wilder is the funny man, and to try and top him with funny stories wasn't the best thing to do. As I said, my contribution was fairly simple from an editing point of view. It's one of my favourite films of all time, and the relationship I had with a man like Billy Wilder is I will never forget.
How did you first become involved with Walter Mirisch?
Well, I had worked 20 years for MGM, not only in this country but also in California, and in 1966 I was offered a film to be produced by Walter Mirisch and to be shot largely in Switzerland. American director called, I think, David Miller. So I made my regrets to MGM, and I thought, I'm a big boy now, I don't need Mother Metro, I'll go for my first freelance film. So I chose this film in Switzerland, which was called The Bells of Hell Go Ting-a-ling-a-ling, which is a World War I story about aircraft being smuggled across Switzerland into Germany for an air raid on Zeppelin factories. It's a lovely script. And so we all went to Switzerland, I set up a cutting room there, and 6 weeks went by, or even 7 weeks, and we had only, I think, a very short amount of screen time, only a few minutes of screen time, because the director was having great problems into deciding what he wanted to shoot, and I think the man was probably sick. But he wasn't working well at all. So the Mirisch brothers came from California to Switzerland to look at the screen footage which I had and to assess the situation, and they decided, having done that the weather was about to fold in Switzerland. We were going to get snow and ice and exactly what we didn't want for the movie. So they decided one Saturday evening, having arrived, I think only the day before, they called everybody together in the hotel where we were billeted and said, "I'm very sorry, but we're folding this movie. It can't be done." So that was my first freelance film, and after 6 or 7 weeks, I was suddenly out of work. But before we left Switzerland, Walter Mirisch said to me, and bearing in mind that I'd met him in California socially in directors' houses, at parties and so on. So he knew me, even this was my first work for him. But he came to me that night in Switzerland and said, "Hopefully I'll be able to make this up to you one day." And that's exactly what he did. That was in 1966. And therefore, in 1968, towards the end of 1968, he asked me to meet Billy Wilder, and that's how we got together and how I edited The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes.
Now, on the conversation of The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes again, do you recall there was some other footage that has been mentioned outside of those main sequences that were cut? First of all, there was the prologue,
Yes.
where the modern-day Watson arrives at the bank, but on the top of a London bus.
That's right.
And the Baker twins, I believe, were sitting on the bus.
Exactly. With Britain is Best or something on their T-shirts.
That's right.
Certainly
that brings
about
back the
Britain.
memory.
That's right. But it was a lovely red London bus, and the young Dr. Watson of the present day, the grandson, of course, was on his way back to look at this material in the vault. And it turned out that he was working in Canada, not as a medical doctor, but as a vet. He was a vet in Canada. And so the film started on the bus and then in the London Bank vault, and having produced all these things from the strongbox, where the old deerstalker and the pipe and hypodermic syringe and so on, and pictures of Mycroft, the brother, and of course the 4 manuscripts of the stories. But then the film opened in the old days with Holmes and Watson travelling on a train, having been on a case, I can't think where, but they were on a case, and they were coming home to London on the train, and somebody burst into the compartment in a very agitated state, and within the next 7 or 8 minutes, Holmes had figured out exactly what had happened to this man, who had apparently been visiting the wife of some earl or lord and having an illicit love affair. And Holmes figured out that he was disturbed in the woman's bedroom with her, of course, and he had to jump out of the window and hobbled it and managed to get onto this train. But Holmes sorted out within a few minutes why exactly this man was on the train in such an agitated state. Then we went from the train into Baker Street, and the story started to unfold as per script. But there was one other episode which wasn't one of the 4 main episodes, but this happened towards the end of the film when Holmes and a lady were travelling to Scotland, and Watson had been banished to the third-class compartment because he was now supposed to be his valet. He was the Sherlock Holmes valet, and Holmes and this lady were travelling in a sleeping car, 2 separate bunks, of course, up to Scotland, and she started talking to him about his something to do with women in the life of Sherlock Holmes. And he told her a story which was during his undergraduate days at Oxford, when he was the member of one of the rowing teams, and if the team won, and one of the members of that winning team was drawn, the name was drawn from a hat, and the prize was a visit to a prostitute in one of the boathouses. and that was all shot as a flashback from the train journey, all shot at Oxford, and that unfortunately is also not in the movie of today.
Do you recall, Ernie, who played the prostitute? I thought it was Penny Brahms, but I discovered a still at BFI recently of a still of that girl, and they claim it's Jenny Hanley.
Well, it certainly wasn't Jenny Hanley. We're talking about 25 years ago, and I'm not a young man anymore. I'm coming up to 74 next month, but I think it was Penny Brahms, as I remember Jenny Hanley very well, but I'm sure it wasn't her.
There's one other sequence I recall, at least this is what Clive Revill recited to me when I met him recently at Disney in Hollywood. He mentioned a scene where he makes a second attempt to present to Holmes, or is it Watson, the violin.
Well, yes, I don't think it was. Let me tell you exactly what I recall, and this is the way I wanted to end the film, as it was finally cut down to just over 2 hours. The ballet sequence, which was in the film, of course, when Holmes was invited by the ballerina to father a child for her, because he was such a brilliant man, she wanted to have a brilliant child. And Clive Revill was her major domo or something like that. And the only way that Holmes got out of this rather embarrassing request was to say that he and Dr. Watson had a certain relationship. And Clive Revill had to say, pederast. And of course the ballerina went absolutely raving mad, and of course that was the way Holmes managed to get out of it. But of course in Clive Revill's mind, Watson was one of those people. He liked men. And so eventually there was a scene towards the end of the film, in fact it could have been the ending, where Revill came to Baker Street, and I think he had two gifts. One was the violin, which he'd been offered to Holmes if he'd fathered the child of this ballerina, a very expensive and beautiful violin. And the other, having presented Holmes with the violin, Revill then went to Watson with a huge bunch of flowers as a little token of his affection. And I thought, remembering Some Like It Hot, and 1, 2, 3, The Apartment, they all had one classic ending. I mean, Some Like It Hot was, well, nobody's perfect. The Apartment, Shirley MacLaine says, shut up and deal. And in the 1, 2, 3, I think it was either Coca-Cola or Pensacola that got mixed up. And so I said to Billy Wilder, why don't we end with that scene with the violin and the flowers? And he wouldn't have it at all. And I was to be interviewed by Sam Spiegel for my next movie, which was called Nicholas and Alexandra. And I went to see Mr. Spiegel. I've never met him before. And he said, how did you get on with Billy Wilder? I told him. And I probably very foolishly said that this is the way I wanted to end the film. And Sam Spiegel immediately got on the phone in his office to Billy Wilder and told him exactly what I'd said. And I don't think Mr. Wilder was very happy about the fact that I blabbed Sam Spiegel. But I still think it would have been the way to end that movie. At the moment it ends in a rather downbeat way, with Holmes retreating into his bedroom with some cocaine and a syringe, because he's heard about the death of the woman spy in Japan.
Ernie, is there anything you'd like to add to your experience of working on The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes?
Well, I think the main thing that I remember, when the film was released, the short version, of course, the current theatrical version, was it had totally misunderstood. Because I think people were looking for the sort of films have been seen years before with Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce as Holmes and Watson, and they were wanting the Hands of the Baskervilles or those sort of stories. But this was really tongue-in-cheek and very personal memories of a totally different nature. And now when the film is shown on television, or I'm working at the National Film School at Beaconsfield in England at the moment, and my students are constantly, each year we get a new batch of students that constantly want to see the film with me and to talk about it, because it's a film which most students thoroughly enjoy and think it's a very good piece of work, which I'm sure it is, and no doubt about that. It's a fine piece of work.
And do you see any of the cast members at all? I know a lot of them have passed on, but like Robert Stevens is still acting.
You see what happened, I had a slight accident in 1979, which is only 9 years after this film. I mean, I carried on working after Sherlock Holmes. I went from film to film to film. Fortunately, I was never out of work. But when 1979 came along, I was working on a film called Superman 2, directed by Richard Lester, and I had an accident, and it's a medical accident, unfortunately. And although I did go back to work after this happened, after a few months I decided that I should not push my luck. And it can be very stressful at times. Although I had an easy time on Sherlock Holmes, editing major feature films is not a piece of cake. Sometimes it's very difficult. And I decided to stop. I wasn't broke. I had getting on for 40 film screen credits on feature films, so I retired rather early. And I had a call from an old colleague who was currently working at the National Film School in Beaconsfield, which is just north of London, to say, what has been happening to you, because I haven't seen your name recently in the Screen International. And I said, well, I retired. And this lady said, well, that's a joke. You surely haven't retired. And I said, well, I have. Told her what happened. She said, well, come to lunch. So I came out to Beaconsfield for lunch, and I stayed for 4.5 years as an editing tutor, which was very interesting. And I stopped after 4.5 years because I thought I'd made my contribution, but I still come on 1 day a week to the editing department at Beaconsfield, and I don't have to attend meetings. I'm not involved in admin. I just look at movies with students and tell them where they should recut it for next week, and it's marvellous as far as I'm concerned. At my age, I think I'm very lucky to be able to do that.
Well, thank you very much, Ernie.
It's a pleasure.